Elena Cross had spent $11 million on specialists, 3 different countries' worth of therapists, and 14 months of silence from her own daughter, and none of it had done what one ordinary man in a faded work jacket did in 11 minutes on a Tuesday afternoon. She was standing behind a hedge, close enough to see but not to be seen, when she heard something she hadn't heard in over a year, her daughter, laughing. Not a polite half-smile for a therapist's clipboard. Not the careful, coached nod Ivy gave to doctors who asked if she was doing okay today. A real laugh, bright and unguarded, the kind that used to fill their old house before everything went quiet. Elena's knees actually buckled a little. She had to put a hand against the hedge to steady herself, because whatever she was watching felt too fragile and too impossible to trust with her full weight yet. Before I tell you what happened next, and trust me, it gets a lot more complicated than one afternoon in a garden. If stories about broken hearts finding their way back matter to you, hit that like button right now and drop a comment telling me if you've ever watched someone you love slowly disappear into silence. It helps more than you know. And subscribe if you want more stories like this one, because this journey is only getting started. Let's go back to the beginning, because you need to understand exactly how far Ivy had traveled to get to that laugh, and how little Elena actually knew about the man standing across the garden from her daughter. 14 months earlier, Ivy Cross had been a chatty, fearless 7-year-old who narrated her entire day out loud to anyone who'd listen, who introduced herself to strangers in elevators, who once talked an airline pilot into letting her sit in the cockpit for a photo. Then, on a rain-slicked highway outside the city, a car accident took her father's life in the space of about 4 seconds, and something in Ivy simply closed like a door being locked from the inside. She didn't stop talking entirely, not at first. She answered direct questions in short, careful sentences. She said please and thank you, but the easy, tumbling chatter was gone, replaced by a watchfulness that made Elena's chest ache every single time she caught her daughter studying a room before deciding whether it was safe to exist in it. Within 2 months, even the short sentences started disappearing around anyone who wasn't Elena or their longtime housekeeper. By month 4, Ivy had stopped speaking to strangers entirely, not out of shyness, the specialists eventually agreed, but out of something closer to grief so large her small body had run out of room to process it while also managing conversation. Elena Cross was not a woman accustomed to problems money couldn't fix. She'd built Cross Dynamics from a single patent in her garage into one of the most valuable logistics technology companies on the continent, a fact business magazines love to reference alongside words like relentless and unstoppable. She flew in specialists from 4 countries. She tried 3 separate therapeutic approaches, 2 experimental programs, and 1 very expensive equine therapy retreat that Ivy tolerated without ever really engaging. Nothing moved the needle. Ivy remained polite, careful, and almost entirely closed off from anyone outside their small household for 14 straight months, until the Tuesday everything started to change. Here's the part that matters most, so don't look away yet. The man who caused that laugh wasn't a specialist. He wasn't on any payroll Elena had approved personally. He was simply the new groundskeeper. His name was Daniel Cole, and he'd been hired 6 weeks earlier through a property management company to handle the grounds of Elena's countryside estate, the kind of quiet, competent man who showed up early, worked efficiently, and left without ever asking to be noticed. He was in his mid-30s, broad-shouldered in the understated way of someone who'd once done serious physical work and had simply never lost the habit of moving carefully through space. He kept mostly to himself, exchanging brief, courteous nods with the household staff, never lingering, never intruding. Elena barely registered him as a person during those first weeks. He was a line item, a service, someone who kept the roses trimmed and the gravel paths tidy while she worked 18-hour days trying to hold her company and her family together with roughly equal amounts of desperation. Then, 3 weeks ago, Ivy started following him. At first it was small, watching from the porch while he worked, close enough to see but careful to stay unnoticed, exactly the way she watched every room before deciding whether to enter it. Daniel never pushed. He never tried to coax her closer, never performed the kind of forced cheerfulness so many well-meaning adults had tried on Ivy over the past 14 months. all of it bouncing harmlessly off whatever wall she'd built. He simply kept working, occasionally narrating what he was doing out loud to no one in particular. This rose needs a deeper cut or it won't bloom right next spring. The way you talk to a cat you were trying to earn the trust of without ever looking directly at it. 2 weeks ago, Ivy started bringing him a glass of water in the afternoons, setting it on the low garden wall without a word, then retreating to watch from a safe distance while he drank it. 1 week ago, she sat down near him for the first time, close enough to hand him tools when he gestured for them, still without speaking. And this Tuesday, according to the housekeeper who witnessed it first and immediately called Elena at the office in a voice thick with disbelief, Ivy had asked Daniel a question. A real one, out loud, unprompted. Something about why the roses needed such a deep cut. And when he'd answered, gently, without making any fuss about the fact that she'd spoken at all, Ivy had laughed at something he said next. A real, unguarded laugh that hadn't touched her voice in 14 months. That's the laugh Elena had rushed home to catch the tail end of, standing behind a hedge with her hand pressed flat against the leaves, watching her daughter come back to life in front of a man she barely knew. If you're feeling that lump in your throat right now, you're not alone. Drop a comment with the word breakthrough, because that's exactly what this was, even if nobody involved understood yet how deep this story actually went. Elena didn't approach them that afternoon. She stood behind the hedge until her legs stopped shaking, then quietly retreated back to the house, torn between overwhelming gratitude and a sharper, less comfortable feeling she didn't examine too closely yet, the instinct of a mother who had spent 14 months being told nothing would work, suddenly confronted with evidence that something had, and needing urgently to understand why. That evening, she asked Daniel to stay a few minutes after his shift ended, the first real conversation they'd had beyond scheduling logistics. He seemed uncomfortable with the attention, deflecting gently when she tried to thank him, insisting he hadn't done anything special, that Ivy had simply decided, in her own time, that the garden felt safe. She hasn't spoken to a stranger in 14 months, Elena said, watching his face carefully. Whatever you're doing, it isn't nothing. Daniel was quiet for a moment, choosing his words with a deliberateness that struck her even then, before she understood exactly where that deliberateness had come from. I just don't push, he said finally. Some people need you to prove you're not going anywhere before they'll let you in. I figured she'd talk when she was ready, and not a second before, and that was fine by me either way. There was something in the way he said it, steady, unhurried, carrying a weight of understanding that felt disproportionate for a groundskeeper discussing a client's daughter, that snagged in Elena's mind and refused to let go. She started paying closer attention after that conversation, the way any careful person would. And what she found, over the following days, didn't match the quiet, unassuming groundskeeper profile at all. Stay with me here, because this is where the story takes a turn nobody in that garden saw coming. Elena had access to resources most people simply didn't. Private investigators, background verification services, the kind of due diligence her company ran on every major vendor as a matter of course. She told herself, at first, that checking Daniel's background was simple protective instinct, nothing more than any parent would do for a man spending unsupervised hours near her daughter. What came back 3 days later stopped her cold in her office at 11 at night. Daniel Cole wasn't just a groundskeeper who'd fallen into landscaping work after some unremarkable career. He was a former Navy SEAL, 12 years of service, 2 combat deployments, a Silver Star citation buried in a file that had clearly been trimmed down for public consumption. He'd left the service 4 years earlier, around the same time his own wife had died of an aggressive illness that had taken barely 6 months from diagnosis to funeral, leaving him alone with a young son roughly Ivy's age. Elena sat with that information for a long time before she moved again. Everything reframed itself instantly in her mind. The careful, unhurried patience he'd shown Ivy wasn't some natural gentleness he'd simply always possessed. It was something forged deliberately and at enormous cost by a man who understood exactly what it meant to watch someone you loved disappear into grief, and exactly how little forcing the process ever actually helped. He wasn't performing patience with Ivy. He recognized her because he'd walked that exact road himself, with his own son, not so long ago. The next morning, she found him in the garden earlier than his usual start time and asked directly why he'd never mentioned any of it. Daniel's jaw tightened slightly, the first real crack she'd seen in his composure. "Because it's not a story I lead with," he said. "People here seal, and either they want war stories or they start treating you like you're one bad memory away from breaking something. I just wanted a quiet job that let me pick my son up from school on time. That's it. That's the whole reason." "Your son," Elena said carefully. "How old?" "7. His name's Wyatt." A pause, something raw crossing his face before he controlled it. "We lost his mom about 4 years back. Cancer. Fast. Once it showed up, barely 6 months start to finish. He didn't talk much for a long while after either, if I'm honest. Took almost a year before he'd string more than a few words together with anyone who wasn't me." The parallel landed in the garden between them like something physical. "Is that why you're so patient with Ivy?" Elena asked, quieter now. "I don't know how to be any other way with a kid who's grieving," Daniel said simply. "I know what rushing it costs. I watched what it almost cost my own son, back when well-meaning people kept trying to talk him back into being okay before he actually was. If this is landing for you the way it's landing for me, go ahead and hit like right now, because we're about 30 seconds from the part of this story that changes absolutely everything between these two families." Elena asked, hesitantly, if she could meet Wyatt sometime. Daniel agreed, cautiously, and the following weekend brought his son to the estate under the loose pretext of a job that needed an extra set of hands moving mulch. Ivy, watching from her usual careful distance, noticed the boy almost immediately, noticed, specifically, that he moved through the world with the exact same watchfulness she carried herself, the same instinct to study a space before deciding it was safe. Within 20 minutes, the two of them were sitting together on the low garden wall, not talking much, simply existing in each other's company with the easy, wordless understanding that sometimes passes between two people who've survived the same particular kind of loss without ever needing to explain it to each other. By the end of that afternoon, Ivy had said more words directly to Wyatt than she'd said to any stranger in 14 months combined. Elena watched all of it from the porch and found herself, for the first time in over a year, crying in a way that had nothing to do with grief and everything to do with something dangerously close to hope. Over the following weeks, the two families found themselves drawn into an easy, unplanned rhythm. Daniel's work at the estate extending naturally into afternoons where Wyatt came along, the two children building an entire private language of shared quiet, gradually widening into actual conversation, actual laughter, actual play that looked more and more like ordinary childhood instead of careful survival. Ivy started speaking to the housekeeper again. She started speaking, tentatively, to her own therapist, who called Elena within the month to say, cautiously optimistic, that something had clearly shifted. Elena, meanwhile, found herself looking forward to Daniel's arrivals in a way that had nothing to do with landscaping schedules. She noticed the careful way he still deflected any conversation that circled too close to his service record, the flash of something raw whenever Wyatt's mother came up, the specific, hard-won steadiness of a man who'd rebuilt himself once already out of something that should have broken him permanently. She found herself wanting to understand that steadiness more than she'd wanted to understand almost anything in years. One evening, staying late to help him load tools into his truck after Wyatt and Ivy had exhausted themselves chasing fireflies across the lawn, Elena finally asked him the question she'd been circling for weeks. Why landscaping? A man with your record could work anywhere. Private security, consulting, any number of things that would pay triple what I'm paying you. Daniel considered the question seriously, the way he considered most things. Because none of that gets me home for dinner every night. None of it lets me watch my son grow up instead of reading about it in messages from whoever's watching him. I already lost enough of that with his mom being sick. I wasn't going to lose more of it chasing money I don't actually need that badly. That's a rare kind of clarity, Elena said quietly. It cost a lot to get here, Daniel admitted. I'd rather not pay that price twice. Something passed between them in that moment that neither of them named yet, though both of them recognized it clearly enough. If you've made it this far, comment below with second chances, because that's exactly what both of these families were quietly building toward, one careful afternoon at a time. The following months brought slow, deliberate changes for both families. Ivy's therapist eventually reduced her sessions from weekly to bi-weekly, then to monthly, noting in her final formal report that Ivy's progress had accelerated more in 3 months of an organic peer friendship than in the prior year of structured intervention combined. Wyatt, for his part, seemed to steady further too, buoyed by a friendship that asked nothing performative of him, only the same patient, wordless companionship he'd already learned to value. Elena and Daniel's own relationship shifted slowly, carefully, neither of them rushing toward anything neither felt ready for. Dinners that started as simple thank yous for his patience, with Ivy stretched longer each time. Conversations moved past logistics into the kind of honest territory two people only reach once they've decided trust is worth the risk. Elena found herself, for the first time since her husband's death, genuinely looking forward to another person's company rather than merely tolerating it as a necessary part of managing her life. Nearly a year after that first laugh behind the garden hedge, Elena stood in the same spot again, watching Ivy and Wyatt chase each other across the lawn while Daniel walked nearby, glancing up now and then with an easy half-smile that had become entirely familiar to her. Ivy was talking constantly now, narrating her afternoon to anyone who'd listen, fearless again in the exact way she'd been before the accident took that fearlessness away, proof, if anyone had needed it, that healing doesn't arrive on the schedule any specialist can guarantee, and sometimes finds its way in through the quietest, most unassuming doors. Daniel caught her watching and walked over, settling beside her at the garden wall without a word. The same easy silence he'd first offered Ivy over a year ago now extended naturally to her too. "She's happy," Elena said, watching her daughter's laughter carry across the lawn. "So's my boy," Daniel said. "Funny how that happened, don't you think? Two grieving kids finding each other and somehow dragging the rest of us along with them." "I don't think it was luck," Elena said. "I think it was you. Your patience. The way you never once tried to force any of this." Daniel was quiet for a moment, watching the children instead of her. "Maybe it was both of us finally being ready to let something good happen without trying to control every part of it." Elena reached over and took his hand, the first deliberate gesture of its kind between them, and he closed his fingers around hers without hesitation, like he'd simply been waiting for her to be ready. If this story meant something to you, hit that like button, share it with someone who's ever watched a child they love go quiet, and drop a comment telling me which moment hit you hardest: the first laugh, the seal reveal, or the two kids on that garden wall. Subscribe for more stories exactly like this one, because there are plenty more waiting. And if you believe grief can lead somewhere unexpectedly good, type the words "healing finds a way" in the comments below. I want to see how many of you believe it too. Two grieving families, brought together by a groundskeeper's quiet patience and a little girl's slow return to laughter, had found something neither of them had been actively searching for, not just healing, but each other. Sometimes the most powerful transformations don't arrive with fanfare or announcement. Sometimes they arrive quietly, in a garden, in the space between a careful question and an unguarded laugh, in a man who simply refused to rush what needed time to heal on its own.